Oh, G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about on the objectivity of beauty, which was inspired by a conversation with Thomas Jockin, who recently visited the house, and we were sitting in the booth and got into this subject. Thomas Jockin is fantastic and amazing. He teaches on virtue, he's brilliant on classical thinkers like Aristotle. So we were talking about virtue and beauty and different things like that, which he is an expert on, and it was a wonderful discussion. And I also had a conversation about a week later with Tom at Voicecraft, which we explored some of these topics as well. And indeed, I think Mr. Jockin does an extremely good job of bringing together how virtue and the ability and having virtue has a big impact on our ability to even experience beauty and to be beautiful. In that, once we've kind of separated questions of virtue from questions of beauty, that this has caused a lot of problems. So Mr. Jockin's work on this is really, really grand, and I always learn a lot from him, and I appreciate him very much. And this short work, which came out of the conversation, was inspired by the conversation, is going to be exploring, what about this question of the objectivity of beauty, because very few people believe beauty is objective anymore. And beauty is very strange, because in one way it seems obviously a matter of taste and opinion, and in another way it seems far higher than mere taste and preference. So what's going on? And I would say that a lot of aesthetic philosophy has kind of fallen to the wayside. It's not a popular field. I think there's some people bringing it back. Dr. Viveki will talk about the hermeneutics of beauty. I think there are some thinkers, and Jonathan Pageau will mention it. And indeed, I think it's very important. And there were a lot of theologians like Balthasar, and it does seem easier to find interest in the topic of beauty and theology, especially now that Roger Scruton has passed away, who was very adamant, like Russell Kirk, that conservatism was fundamentally an aesthetic movement, and that would be tied to Burke, which is a very interesting perspective, and someone like T.S. Eliot seems to have aligned with that as well. But generally, at this point, the topic of beauty is not really discussed, and actually one of the reasons I think it is because it's too much aligned with the question of art. And we ask, is art beautiful? We say, well, that's a matter of opinion, and it doesn't seem like we can formalize, why art is beautiful or not. And so as a result, we say, well, then there is no objective beauty. It's just subjective. I think this is a mistake. I think identifying the question of beauty too much with things, objects, and their phenomenological or aesthetic characteristics of a thing is very problematic. Because what we end up doing is missing what this paper, I'll talk about the strike of beauty or the experience of beauty. And I think that's a very different thing, and it cannot be reduced to a single thing. But let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine you hear a rumor that someone is coming to town to perform a symphony. It's, you hardly know how to say the word. You've worked in the field all your life. It's 1824. But your uncle has connections, a little money, and you're able to attend. It's a gift. You basically never hear music. Maybe in church, but, when you do, it's hymnals and not really accompanied by instruments very much. And the day arrives. You go to the symphony. And you hear Beethoven's Ninth before it is Beethoven's Ninth. And you never hear it again. And as you age, you tell people about what happened. You tell them this performance, this music you heard, and they nod. So here's the question. Is beauty objective? Walker Percy, and I've mentioned it at Voicecraft on the art presentation, and a number of discussions. Walker Percy, this thought experiment is inspired by him. And he makes the point of, imagine that you come to the forest. You're a Spanish conquistador or something, and you come to the forest, and there's the Grand Canyon. There it is. You've never seen a photograph of it. You have no preset complex. You didn't know it was there, and then it's there. Like, imagine that experience. Walker Percy was very concerned about the inability to really experience Paris because you've seen photographs of Paris before you go. It brings to mind what Walter Benjamin talked about with the loss of aura due to mass production. And for Walter Benjamin, the loss of aura basically meant it was very, very difficult for art to strike us anymore, precisely because we could access it so readily and separate it from the entire context in which it was situated. Again, imagine encountering Beethoven's Ninth before it's Beethoven's Ninth. No one knows about it, and you never hear it again. This would easily transform what you believe was possible in the world, the very horizon of what could arise in the world, and how you could carry yourself in the world. How you live would change. And that very change would be objective. That very change in what you believed was possible in the world would be objective. It would not be a matter of opinion. It would be observable. It would have occurred. That strike, that arising of the unexpected that changes how you live your life, that is on which, and according to which, the question of is beauty objective should be asked. When we ask is Beethoven's Ninth beautiful, well, the issue is Beethoven's Ninth can be listened to on MP3 players. It can be listened to kind of casually in the background of a movie. It can be the background music of a movie. It can be something we listen to 100 times. Or it can be something that in 1824 we listen to once and never again. The strike, the way beauty can strike us and change us through and with Beethoven's Ninth is completely relative to the whole context. And the question cannot be reduced to just the music of Beethoven's Ninth from that whole context. And the moment you do reduce it to just Beethoven's Ninth, well, then you enter into a question about the music itself, and is the music itself beautiful? Now, I think it is, but now you're in a formal question. Now you get into debates about the instruments and the harmonies and different things, of which, at the end of the day, doesn't necessarily convince anyone, and ultimately seems to be a privileged discussion. Now, I push back on if it's a privileged discussion, and there are thinkers who make cases for why a music like Beethoven's Ninth is in of itself uniquely beautiful versus something on the radio. But the point cannot be, I think the point should be stressed, that asking the question about the thing, the particular beauty of the music of Beethoven's Ninth, it's much more difficult to understand why beauty is objective. And it seems far more like beauty is just a subjective thing and fluffy. Whereas when you ask the question of beauty by the strike of this one-of-one experiences, and you say that strike is beauty, that moment that strikes you and changes how you live, that is beauty. Whereas perhaps just looking at a painting in a given museum is more just an issue of pretty or nice or aesthetically pleasing. Well, then it becomes much easier to see why beauty is objective. And indeed, the person in the experience knows if they undergo this strike I'm describing, they know that strike occurred and that it is not reducible to their mere preference, because it frankly is a kind of suspension of their preference. It's kind of like they're caught in disbelief. They're caught up in something they didn't know was going to occur. They couldn't just be reduced to their presuppositions and assumptions because they didn't know this was going to happen. So they don't have assumptions about what's going to happen. Now they can remember it once it occurs, but it comes out of nowhere. And it doesn't fit into those categories. And then therefore it opens up new categories of what can be in the world. And that opening up of new categories is objective. It does indeed occur. And the way that they see the world does in fact change. And that is not a matter of subjective opinion. It's literally a matter of seeing the world differently. And the emergence of that new way of seeing is objective. It occurred. Again, I think it's just very important to realize that when we ask the question of beauty of particular works of art, as opposed to the entire experience in which the art is experienced, and the question of the strike that becomes possible in that holistic experience, then beauty in its uniqueness does tend to be lost, because we're not asking the question of beauty correctly. We have to ask the question of beauty relative to a irreducible holistic experience, not just simply in the object. When you focus just on the object in its independence, not asking the conditions by which it is experienced, everything changes. Beauty is an irreducibility. And beauty is a strength that changes how we live our lives and what we believe is possible. And you could associate this with things like, I think, Heidegger's being, like when being really unveils itself, when being really unfolds itself, it may be associated with some other thinkers of maybe German idealism that stress the sublime experience that cannot be reduced to categories. And there is this sense that beauty somehow is the beatific vision of Dante that transcends. Transcendence and beauty go together. But the issue is, yes, there is something transcendent about beauty, but it's transcendent in that it doesn't fit into your preconceived categories, and thus is transcendent of them, but it changes the horizon of your categories after that. So it's not like a disembodied transcendence, it's a transcendence that then becomes reintegrated into your life and what you believe is possible, and thus changes how you live according to these new possibilities you now know are out there or could be out there, and what else may be out there. And that is an objective change. I do think today, because of mass production and the ability to listen to music all the time, to see photographs of places we visit before we go there, I think this has all made it actually more difficult for beauty to be found in art, in art pieces. And that's why, when we associate the question of beauty too much with the arts, we can lose it. And then beauty doesn't seem special, because I think actually it's getting now more difficult to be struck by beauty in artistic circumstances because of mass production, because of expectation. It's just incredibly difficult for a script or a place or a song to really strike us and change the horizon by which we see the world. It may have to be located more so in a great athlete, a great performance, a great accomplishment, something outside of works of art. Something like I say, like a great dance. And the artist then the artist who knows this, the difficulty of artworks to create beauty, may have to change their performance or their process to more align with beauty. So, for example, a dancer may have to decide never to film his or her performance, and it be something that occurs randomly in random locations for whoever happens to see it. But this is a great sacrifice, because that would mean the dancer risks no one seeing it and having to do it again and again every time. And I'm not trying to say that the reproduction MP3s photographs are bad or inherently bad. They indeed allow people to hear Beethoven's Ninth who otherwise never would. But it's trade-offs. It comes with a great trade-off. And it's a trade-off that particularly can confuse us on the topic of beauty. Because, again, these works don't have the same aura. And so then beauty as a very important category to defend, to write on, to think about, falls to wayside. Because what ends up happening is then when philosophers and thinkers go to, say, defend beauty, they defend beauty in things. They try to argue that, Mona Lisa is objectively beautiful, or that Beethoven's Ninth is objectively beautiful. And whether or not that can be accomplished, I don't really believe it can, because I think it falls into the Derrida deconstruction of the metaphysics of the gap, as I call it, between the signifier and the signified. It's going to be very difficult to say that the Mona Lisa somehow in of itself is objectively beautiful. But as I try to argue in Reconstructing Aza and on typography in particular, the Aristotelian metaphysics of the apprehension of the reading, the reading per se, that the paper will talk about, but the raw apprehension itself is not deconstructed by Derrida. And when we talk about the strike of beauty, that is an apprehension that is not deconstructed and occurs. And it occurs. And the reality of that occurrence is objective to the person to whom it occurs to. And then the evidence that indeed occurred, that beauty indeed occurred, is how they change their life and how they see things differently. This is all objective. This is not mere preference. But this side of beauty, where we find the objectivity of beauty in a holistic experience, doesn't tend to be the direction that thinkers and philosophers go in, because they get caught up in trying to defend beauty in a particular work of art. And so, unfortunately, I think that's a losing battle. Now, Thomas Jockin is also doing work and speaks brilliantly on how in Plato, basically education is not possible without beauty, without a sense that there is something in the world that can disclose itself and show that the way we think the world is not how the world necessarily is, and that its horizon can be far vaster than we believe. Well, this, my goodness, we need to be educated then. Like, if the world is a place that can disclose itself in a Heideggerian sense, or unveil depths like the experience of Beethoven's Ninth before Beethoven's Ninth, then education, and if education is the conditioning to be able to have those experiences, and that's another part. Like, indeed, it does seem like to be struck by beauty in the way that's described, there's some conditioning that seems to occur, but notice I'm not saying taste, I'm saying conditioning, work, openness. And this gets into the paper Conditionalism, that's also in Reconstructing A as A, and then that all gets into the Fate of Beauty book by O.G. Rose. Carrying out that condition, there's now an incentive, if you believe in beauty, to do the work, to undergo that conditioning so that you can have the world strike you and change what you believe is possible. And then education is in the business of conditioning people for that. And so I think Mr. Jockin is brilliant to be doing this work, to see the role of beauty in education for Plato. And I look forward to his work, and I highly suggest, and I'm grateful for the conversation we had. For more by Mr. Jockin, check out his YouTube page. Be on the lookout for updates on what he'll be working on, what he'll be teaching on. Again, I highly suggest Thomas Jockin, and appreciate him very much. And thank you so much for your time.